music? China? What are they even saying? What is this Chinese rap music? Sounds like they're just saying ching chang chong.
My chance new girl watch made in China. We play ping pong ball made in China.
Hello and welcome to China Econ Talk. I'm your host, Jordan Schneider. When you think of George Marshall, maybe you think of him as Army Chief of Staff, the adult in the war room corralling the likes of Eisenhower, Patton, and Montgomery to victory in World War II. Or perhaps you remember the Marshall Plan, his plan to use American economic resources to immunize Europe from communism. So, what are we doing on China Econ Talk talking about George Marshall? Well, the man from 1945 to 1947 spent his time in China downing baijiu with Mao and playing Chinese checkers with the Generalissimo, all in efforts to stave off civil war. Before there was the Marshall Plan, Marshall pushed Congress to approve a huge military and economic aid package to stave off conflict in China. So, was the loss of China to the CCP inevitable? Did Marshall in any way contribute to it? And what can we learn from Marshall's expedition to China about the limits of American influence abroad? This episode in History of Marshall and China, which his Wikipedia page only lends 5 sentences, is the subject of Dan Kurtz-Phelan's new 500-page book, The China Mission, George Marshall's Unfinished War, 1945 to 1947. Dan Kurtz-Phelan is currently the executive editor of Foreign Affairs and previously was on Hillary Clinton's policy planning staff from 2010 to 2012. Dan, welcome to China Econ Talk.
Thank you so much for having me.
So, how'd you stumble across this topic, and why did you think narrative history was the right angle of approach?
It's a great question. So Marshall, I worked in the policy planning staff, as you noted. The policy planning staff is a part of the Secretary of State's office that was created by George Marshall when he was Secretary of State in 1947. He wanted a strategy outfit in the State Department, which it did not have before. Because it was created by George Marshall, because the first thing policy planning did was forge the Marshall Plan, was create the plan that helped save Europe, is probably the most successful example of U.S. foreign policy making in our history, or arguably is. Marshall looms over that office and looms over everything you do. And we tell stories, there's kind of a myth we tell about that time that really focuses on the Marshall Plan, on the creation of our alliances, on the creation of this model of American leadership in foreign policy that really sustained us through the Cold War and is still the template that we look to today. But we left out this part of his biography. And I wanted to go back and tell the story of what was really one of the most consequential decisions, one of the most consequential things that George Marshall did during this period, but that gets left out of the usual story, the kind of myth we tell. And on the narrative history point, when you go from, I'd worked as a journalist and editor outside of government and then went into government in 2009 for the first time. And one thing that I felt was that so much of the human element, the real decisions that are made by policymakers trying to face problems in real time with limited information and all the kind of limitations that any human being facing a decision is affected by, so much of the texture of that is left out of some of the history that we tell. And so I wanted to create a narrative that would really give you the feel of being there in the moment, facing these decisions as the characters in history face them, rather than kind of telling it deterministically as history often does. And what you get is this character who we think of as this kind of gray stoic figure facing what is probably one of the most consequential and hardest problems in the history of American foreign policy, and that's the story of the China Mission.
And it's interesting because a lot of these bureaucratic history books, it either runs two ways. Either we have these geniuses who consider everything and come to the right plan and it works out,
right,
or we have these bumbling idiots who screw up and then there's a war or a catastrophe. But here and in your book, we have Marshall, who really knows his stuff, but at the same time isn't able to solve this problem, and the forces are just too big for him to get his hands around, even with all of the backing and might and popularity that he came into this with this mission.
That's right. It's sort of a story of a great man, of this can-do figure accepting what he couldn't do, what he couldn't achieve, and trying to reckon with the consequences of that. And just going back to the why of this book, so much of what we do in foreign policy is managing impossible problems and failure. And that gets left out of the history sometimes. And so I wanted to tell a story of someone who I do think is a great figure, a great strategist and diplomat, taking on something that he couldn't do.
Yeah, it's interesting because this also sort of feeds into this classic China arc, which was probably captured most eloquently in Jonathan Spence's To Change China, where basically
Jonathan Spence is more eloquent than almost anyone, so I will take that.
Where basically the idea is a white guy shows up shows up to China and the hopes, with these high hopes of reshaping the country and his image, and ends up leaving disappointed and chastened. So Marshall, again, who had probably more power than any other foreigner over China in the history of China, ends up kind of running into this same wall and these same limitations. So I'm curious if any thoughts on that or other books or narratives that really helped you formulate what you wanted this book to look like.
To Change China is an absolutely spectacular book. I think it's one of Jonathan Spence's early works and is really worth going back to. The kind of arc you describe, I think, is you see it at so many points in the history of the U.S. interaction with China, going back to the 19th century and extending through the present. And the kind of cycle, as I see it, is one that Marshall lived through in 1946 and 47, and we're really living through now in a somewhat analogous way. So for Marshall, he gets there, he kind of projects his hopes about how China will change, what he's likely to accomplish there in the first phase. In the second phase, he resists giving up those hopes, kind of clings to this wishful thinking and gives them up only very, very reluctantly. And then the third phase, which is the kind of who lost China phase in the history, there's this furor of charges of betrayal and recrimination that consume the American political scene and body politic for much longer. And we're in a kind of similar moment now where there were these hopes about what the first phase of American engagement with China after Nixon's opening in almost 40 years ago, almost 40 years ago, what that was likely to achieve. And then this kind of moment now where we're wondering why the relationship did not develop in the way a lot of people hoped it did at the time.
Yeah, it's interesting because another theme of this book, which we'll get into, is the arc not just with the elites but with public opinion and the as time goes on, folks get less and less sanguine about Chang, about involvement in China, about hopes for its future. So before we get too far into that, let's bring us back to 1945. So what was the state of affairs after Japan surrenders, and what were all these American troops doing in China?
It's a fascinating history. So let me actually start with who Marshall is, because I think he's someone that we all come across in history books as this kind of great figure of this period, this kind of figurehead of the greatest generation or the wise men. But at this moment, he really is, at the end of World War II, he really is the kind of one of the towering figures in the world, really. He's not just in the United States. He's been Army Chief of Staff for 6 years. He started that job the morning or same day that Hitler invaded Poland. So he's really seen the entire course of World War II. And after U.S. involvement started, he's been one of the key figures shaping American involvement in the war and shaping Allied victory. Churchill famously called him the organizer of victory. He has this incredible public profile. There's a draft Marshall movement trying to persuade him to run for president. Harry Truman calls him one of the greatest military leaders that ever lived. You read these accounts of the kind of great figures of the time just going into raptures when they talk about him. But Marshall at this moment he's over it. Is exhausted,
He wants to ride into the Leesburg, Virginia sunset, play some croquet.
That's exactly right. He's about to turn 65 years old. He's had this very intense 6 years. His wife, Catherine Marshall, really wants him to retire. She has vacations planned for them. And there's this moment the day after his retirement ceremony in the courtyard of the Pentagon, which is a very new building at that point. They ride to Leesburg, Virginia, an hour or so outside of Washington. Marshall stands, looks across his lawn, thinks about retirement, which has just begun, walks into his house, and then really within minutes, the phone rings in his house. And it turns out it's the president on the line just asking him this one last little favor, what he thinks will just take a couple of months, and then Marshall can really retire. Now, for Truman, as he looks at China at this moment, it's really this problem that threatens to upend his whole vision of what the post-war is supposed to look like. China is meant to be one of the big four powers that, along with the United States, the United Kingdom, and the Soviet Union, is going to help keep the peace in the post-war. So there are these four policemen, all founding members of the UN Security Council, permanent members, who are together going to make sure we don't get back into another terrible war. That is how the post-war is supposed to look. There are not going to be spheres of influence. There are not going to be major geopolitical tensions anymore. There's going to be this cooperative approach to peace. The problem is China does not really look like a modern great power. It's not democratizing in the way that we had imagined Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalist government. There are very slowly reestablishing control over the Chinese mainland, which has been occupied very brutally by the Japanese for a long time. And they're being challenged by Mao and the communists, who have their headquarters in northwest China, in Yan'an, but are threatening nationalist control.
Yeah, there are these great stories of FDR going to Churchill saying, hey, we want to bring Chiang Kai-shek into the mix, let him come to these meetings. And Churchill's like, are you kidding me? What are these guys doing here?
And Stalin, actually. I mean, it's kind of remarkable how hard the U.S. fought to bring China into that inner circle, never completely, to the incredible frustration of the nationalists and Chiang Kai-shek, but they really wanted China to be one of the great powers.
Sure. Yeah, I remember in negotiating the UN Charter and other important post-World War II documents, you'd have these stories of the Americans not wanting to offend the Chinese, so they would set the meeting times for 4 o'clock with the UK and with the Soviet Union, and then tell the Chinese, oh, we're just starting at 6:30 or whatever.
Right.
And then they would come and be just like, oh, you're late. What, did you get the message? Like, what's the problem here?
Right.
Because the British and the Soviets were so frustrated with these nobodies who are fighting this civil war, who, need America to fly troops over the Himalayas just to get them any guns. The idea that they should have a say in all this stuff is kind of an insult to the other two powers.
Right, and they never trusted them. They never thought they could keep secrets. So in what was seen as a great offense in nationalist eyes, they never knew about the secret agreements at Yalta, which allowed Soviet troops to go into Manchuria in exchange for certain economic concessions. Mostly because no one thought that the Chinese nationalist government would manage to keep it secret.
Sure. So, okay, great. Bringing us up to 1945. So the war ends and the Soviets are in Manchuria because Truman was scared that even after dropping the bomb, the war would continue for another year and this would cost hundreds of thousands of American lives. So wanted to kind of share that kind of finishing it out burden with the Soviet Union.
Right.
But this means that the post-war situation in China is much more complicated than it may have otherwise been.
Right. So you have Soviet troops, about 300,000 Soviet troops in Manchuria at that point. You have roughly 100,000 American troops who are throughout China. Some of them have landed after the war and are holding positions along the coastline. Others have been there supporting the Chinese through the war against Japan. But you have these two outside powers with the troop presence, and then you have the nationalists, you have the communists. The nationalists seem to have a great military advantage, but it's kind of eroding by the day. And then you have this whole array of other forces in China who have kind of shifting alliances and sometimes sort of unclear alliances. So it's an incredibly confused situation.
Sure. You have this great line, this great citation in the book about how the army manual they would give to the privates showing up told them to show the Chinese that we respect them as human beings, which is never a good sign when you need to tell people that. But clearly a lot of tension, which was going to creep up later in this story. So let's come back now to Marshall. So he shows up in Chongqing and is tasked with keeping these two sides from breaking out into full civil war. So what were his aims and what was his strategy to bring the two sides together?
So Truman gives what he thinks will just be this kind of 2-month project to Marshall. Go to Chongqing, which has been the wartime capital of China since the late 1930s. It's where the nationalist government has had its seat, and it's full of American diplomats and journalists and officers and spies from the United States and a whole range of other countries. Truman says, go to Chongqing, broker a peace agreement between the nationalists and communists, make sure that the full-scale civil war does not break out and consume China again. Make sure in the course of that the communists are not going to take power, are not going to win this civil war. At the same time, lay the groundwork for a Chinese democracy, help China become the democratic great power that we imagine it can and should be. And Truman says, look, that's just going to take you, 2 or 3 months. It, of course, doesn't work out. Marshall ends up staying in China for 13 months. And it also starts this whole new phase of his career, which takes him to become Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense later on. But there's this kind of comical moment where Truman, really feeling bad that he's imposing on Marshall the day after his retirement, says, look, it's going to be 2 months, and then you're going to go back to the retirement you've planned. So Marshall gets to Chongqing in December 1945, and to the sort of bewilderment of people there, for the first few weeks, he just listens. They expect, this kind of great figure to come out of his plane and suddenly start making pronouncements about what the Chinese should do and what the United States is going to do. And instead, he says very, very little for these first couple of weeks, and he invites figures from all sides of this and from all walks of life to come and just talk to him about what they want and how they see the situation. Some of them are communists, some of them are nationalists. He asks questions, but he doesn't express a lot about what he sees. And it's only after he's been there for a few weeks that he starts to really move.
Yeah, it's an interesting contrast between him and Eisenhower in Japan, right? I mean, there's John Dower, Embracing Defeat, another fantastic book, where he basically shows up in China and maybe does 3 days of this, and all of a sudden starts
MacArthur, right?
And all of a sudden starts rewriting the Constitution,
right.
Reshaping the entire country based on his vision, which turned out okay, but it was clearly both a different status. I mean, George Marshall wasn't riding in with a conquering army to China, but also a different mindset and a different idea of looking at problems and trying to solve them.
Yeah, I mean, the MacArthur comparison comes up a lot, and it's a really interesting one. The difference, as you point out, is that in Japan, the United States really was a conquering army that had full control and an ability to kind of impose solutions on the Japanese. In China, Marshall was there at the invitation of a partner government, and trying to in a slightly different role mediate an end to this dispute while still not being a neutral mediator in any sense.
It's interesting though, because even after all that listening, it does seem like a lot of the solutions that Marshall comes to are sort of based very directly off the American experience. So he talks about, a bicameral legislature and, democracy and liberalization and open markets and whatnot. And so, even after all of that thinking, and he actually spent a number of years in China in the 1920s, as you write about. So it's funny that not to put a value judgment on whether the American structure is the answer for all the world's problems or not, but he still ends up kind of coming to that conclusion.
That's right. It's a really extraordinary moment. So when Marshall does start really getting into the diplomacy, he has amazing success. Actually, it's kind of miraculous success in his first weeks of really trying to come up with some solution. He gets a ceasefire between the two armies. He gets this agreement to merge the communist nationalist forces. A pretty detailed agreement, actually, where they talked about how in this region there'll be 10 times as many nationalist troops in each division as communist troops. And then he gets this agreement to start building a Chinese democracy. And Marshall's a pretty hard-headed guy. He did not invent this mission, but you see him getting kind of swept up in this democratizing fervor in a way, where he talks about the American model of freedom of speech and freedom of assembly, and he starts talking. He makes analogies to baseball. He at one point comes across. He's a voracious reader. He comes across this volume of speeches by Benjamin Franklin that has been printed for American troops, and he decides to have it translated for the Chinese. And there are these moments, sort of cringeworthy moments, where you see him reading Benjamin Franklin to communist interlocutors. And it feels a little bit like the early days of the Iraq War. It feels very, very familiar in certain ways. Sorry, go ahead.
What's funny is how the Chinese also play this game with him, right? So this is something where you have Zhou Enlai quoting, or Mao saying, we love Washington.
That's right.
And we want to turn into, we want to be that type of person for him. So it's not like these are passive players in the game. They understand what his mentality is and are trying to get the best the best offer for their side, and understand that his vision is this American vision and his reference points are these American reference points. Right. So we'll read Benjamin Franklin. We'll quote it back to you.
That's right. And this is a game they've been playing for a very long time, where both the nationalists and communists have been trying to portray to Americans they meet long before Marshall this image of themselves as very much in the kind of tradition of American republicanism. So you get communists talking about how they're really just agrarian Democrats, and you get all these young American foreign service officers who are very sophisticated and know China very well, and in many cases grew up there and have lived in China for decades, saying, "Oh, these guys are just like Jeffersonian Republicans. They're not real communists." And on the nationalist side, all these figures who went to American colleges and have a lot of experience in the U.S.
Madam Ching, Wesley University graduate.
There's a line from Teddy White, who's a famous Time magazine reporter who wrote a great book called Thunder Out of China towards the end of this story, was there as a reporter during the war and formed a Harvard Club of China in Chongqing, and joked afterwards that half of the nationalist government could have joined because they were all Harvard graduates, which was not actually true, but it was kind of the image that they liked to give to Americans.
Christian also, many of them, which
many,
is an
many
interesting,
of them Christian,
interesting
right.
wrinkle of this.
And there was this, of course, very long missionary tradition in the sense that China was to become this great Christian power, and the fact that the Generalissimo and Madame Zhang were both themselves Christians really helps support that image.
So Zhou Enlai has this great line where he says, when he's trying to flatter someone, "Gongwei," I think is the word, you're really starting to understand China, which I think is a line I have had someone use personally on me.
That's right.
And the whole game between the nationalists and the communists of really, it really is wooing Marshall and wooing Marshall's wife even, to make sure that they sort of got the best deal. So let's come back to American public opinion at the time. And this is something I came out of reading your book a little confused about. Because on the one hand, you have Ernest May saying that in 1945, there was a huge groundswell of support for a really aggressive intervention in China and putting troops on the ground and making sure that Chiang come out on top. But on the other hand, you have another set of sort of documentary evidence of folks saying, what the hell are these American troops doing here? The war's over. Let's get everyone home. So what was it at the time? Because I think the crucial decision in this whole story is Marshall not showing up 1945, deciding not to wholeheartedly back Chiang and join him in this war to finish the communists whose army seemed like it was on its last legs, but giving them this truce and this time to regroup, prove their worth to Stalin, and ultimately gain his support and backing, which led to them having a fighting chance when the Civil War came around.
So it's a really complicated question, and it changes over the course of the period I cover in the book, not just from 1945 to 1947, but then moving forward to 1949 when the People's Republic is finally established, when Mao really wins decisively. And at the beginning, there's on the one hand this kind of emotional support for China. People believe that China is going to become this democratic great power. That had been the kind of line that was used throughout World War II as part of what justified American support for China during the war. But at the same time, Americans really are ready to focus on their own problems for a while. We think of this time as a moment when America kind of stepped forward to lead the world, but the impulse by most Americans right after World War II was to bring the troops home. 400,000 Americans had just died in World War II. A tremendous amount of money had been spent on the rest of the world. And there were economic problems at home as a result of the end of the war, and there was inflation and there were strikes. So there was this really strong impulse to not sacrifice too much for the world's problems at this time. It's something that Marshall had been really worried about when he was Army Chief of Staff, worried about what that kind of isolationist impulse would be after the war. So there was on the one hand this, on a certain level, support for the nationalist Chinese. People thought that they were a cause worth backing on some level, but also a desire not to have to do too much, not to have to send more troops there for too long. In the incidents over the course of Marshall's China mission, when American troops got killed, or there were kind of incidents that started to arise between the U.S. troops and the communists for the most part, you'd have people in the United States say, why the hell is my son out there fighting for this other government? He's been there, he's been at war for years and years. I don't want him to get killed in this complicated civil war. So you have these very contradictory impulses. What really changes over the course of the story is that the Cold War starts. So, in 1945, there still really is this sense, there's a fear of communism at the time, but there still is this sense that there could be this great power peace, that they're going to be the four powers managing the world jointly. And over the course of these 4 years especially, all of a sudden that looks totally fanciful. So by 1947, 1948, you really have Cold War tensions rising in a way that make people see the conflict of China in very different terms. And that's when the kind of debate about how much to intervene to support the nationalists really gets prominent. There's an amazing moment that I find just a kind of eerie historical coincidence when Marshall goes to visit Mao, as he has this period of seeming success, when he seems to have kind of brokered the ceasefire and laid out this vision for a democratizing modern China, unified China. He goes on this kind of victory tour around the country and visits all these places that have been at war for decades and announces the new peace. And he's
hailed as the war of warlords and first warlord of the world. I mean, his reception is really remarkable.
It's amazing. And he's greeted by families, and there are school groups that sing to him. And in the kind of culminating moment of this, he goes and he meets with Mao in Yunnan and has this kind of extraordinary 24-hour visit in the communist capital. And as he's meeting with Mao and they're talking about how much the Chinese can learn from the United States and this kind of future of friendship and peace, at that very same moment, the communists are also watching very carefully a tour around the United States that Winston Churchill is making. And on the same day that Marshall and Mao are having this meeting and talking about friendship, Winston Churchill is in Fulton, Missouri, talking about the Iron Curtain that's descending between the United States and the Soviet Union, or the West and the communist world. And the communists at this moment, as they start to see the growing international tensions, they say, you know what, there's a very different future coming. There's a future of tension and competition between the Soviets and the United States, and that means something very different for the domestic conflict of China. And of course, the nationalists see the same thing.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, this was the big fear that Marshall was thinking about throughout this process is we don't want Americans fighting a proxy war with the Soviets, which ironically they end up doing 4 years later in Korea. So the big question is whether or not a bigger commitment at this time would have staved off the Korean War, the Vietnam War, and having a strong ally in China. So we have Marshall. He gets everyone together. He signs this plan. They're integrating the armies. There is a primary school for the nationalists to kind of all learn democracy and work together with
the communists to learn how to be the modern troops.
Yeah,
they're actually going to be American officers training communist soldiers, which is kind of amazing.
Yeah, which, I mean, has plenty of contemporary echoes in Pakistan and Afghanistan and Iraq and Syria, which we'll get to soon. But let's come back to Marshall flying home triumphantly and now having to persuade Congress that this is a deal we should support. So what were the dynamics there? On the one hand, we have Truman, who, although a down-home senator from Missouri who never had a college degree, is sort of the globalist's globalist in this whole moment and really wants to give this peace backing the support he thinks it needs. But senators, and as you said, public opinion, were really against it. So what did Marshall do in particular to try to make this happen?
So Marshall has brokered this agreement. He sees the kind of outline of a new China, a new Chinese government, but he believes that in order to make it work, it's going to take a lot of American assistance. It's going to take a lot of money. It's going to take advisors. And part of that is in making the kind of mechanics of a new government work, but he's also really starting to focus on the needs of individual people and how you keep people fed, how you get people jobs, how you make sure that inflation doesn't skyrocket and get out of control. This is a lot of what he starts to talk about in the context of the Marshall Plan in Europe a couple of years later, but he's really starting to see the importance of those factors in China, and he realizes that if this new vision is really going to take hold, it's going to take a ton of support from the United States to make it happen.
Sure.
But he's hearing from his contacts back in Washington, from President Truman, from people in the State Department, that Congress is not in a very generous mood, that it's going to be really hard to get the kind of financial commitment that he thinks is necessary. And so shortly after he visits Mao, when he thinks he has the agreements basically finalized, there are a few little details that still need to be worked out, he gets on a plane and flies back to Washington to lobby Congress to put together what is really sort of a Marshall Plan for China.
Sure.
And he spends about a month back in Washington just having these kind of very intensive meetings with...
Too busy for Churchill, apparently.
That's right.
Who was in town at the time.
That's right. He missed his goddaughter's baptism and had to cancel on Churchill, which is an indication about how hard he was working. He said, "I'm working harder here than I was during the war," which is probably not quite true, but it does give some indication that he was. But
then again, he famously, would leave the office at 4:00 and play a round of golf every day. Right.
That's right. So, he would go riding. He had these collapses from nervous exhaustion when he was younger, and so he was very disciplined about kind of stopping work and getting rest and recreation, which did not mean he didn't work hard. It just meant that he had this kind of discipline when it came to stopping at a certain point.
So maybe Chinese tech CEOs could learn from the Marshall method and not working 7 days a week.
Someone else should write a book. Or I would probably make more money if I wrote a book about Marshall's management secrets. Because he really is a kind of just amazing leader and manager. both during the war and during the China mission and later.
For sure, yeah. Putting Lincoln to shame, right? Lincoln, I think, was much more stressed than him in this regard. You know?
Yeah, exactly.
So when he's doing this negotiation with Congress, we have a lot of interesting echoes to contemporary thoughts about the importance or lack thereof for U.S. spending on foreign policy. One congressman you quote saying that Marshall would spend America's dwindling resources to give other countries a degree of prosperity we haven't achieved at home, which, given the, 30 straight years of wartime that China has been in, more or less, is a pretty absurd statement. But at the same time, it gives a real sense of flavor of what was going on in Capitol Hill at this time.
And sorry, let me add one detail. One thing I did is I went back and looked at the newspapers from the period, just to in part to look at what they were saying about Marshall, but also what they were saying about these kind of questions more generally. And there was this controversy that was covered in the Chicago Tribune about a whiskey shortage in the Midwest. And there was a point when they were blaming shipments of grain to starving populations elsewhere for a whiskey shortage, which just gave some flavor of the politics at the time.
Well, it's there's your echo right now. I mean, we have the trade war and we have whiskey tariffs.
That's right.
We go from 1789 or whatever whiskey. We have the Whiskey Rebellion. We have We have whiskey fights 1946. We have China raising the price on my Black Label in
there's probably
China.
A book here as well.
Okay, but at the same time, it seems that this engagement strategy is losing its power. As Marshall leaves the country, everything seems to fall apart. So what were the factors that were ripping apart the two sides at this point? Because at one point, they seemed pretty convincingly committed to giving this engagement strategy a shot.
Right. Marshall, I mean, one indication of how far along he thinks he is, as he's flying back to Washington, he stops in Los Angeles and meets with Frank Capra, the director, who's about to start directing a movie called It's a Wonderful Life. Which is, of course, very famous now. Marshall sits down with Frank Capra and they talk about making a series of instructional videos in Chinese for Chinese audiences to learn how democracy works. And this is how the kind of detail here, the kind of thought he's giving to this project of instilling democratic values in the Chinese. But as he's away, things
shout out, by the way, for the on YouTube right now. You can watch these great Frank Capra, like, what is democracy? What are the Japanese? Like, who are we fighting? Fantastic stuff if you want to kill a few hours on.
It was an Academy Award-winning film that he had done during the war for Marshall. So they worked together during World War II, called Why We Fight. So Marshall thought he could do a version of that in Chinese for Chinese audiences to make the post-war.
Because of course, Frank Capra, really knows his audience.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly.
On a little tangent for you. Right now, the big trend in Chinese box office returns is the Hollywood directed stuff is losing out to domestic movies, and there's been this turning point, it seems, where cheap Chinese stuff, relatively affordable Chinese movies are beating like Venom, because it's like a love story directed by a Chinese director with a Chinese script that like resonates and is present or whatever. So yeah, Frank Capra, probably not the guy to teach China democracy.
Right. Exactly. So Marshall's gone. He's talking to Frank Capra. He's talking to Congress, trying to put together this enormous assistance package for the new China that is coming into shape, he thinks. And as he's there, things really start coming apart. So there are these agreements that he's made, political agreements, military agreements between the two sides that start to unravel. And in part it's because there are details that are not really worked out. They both, in part because of the pressure that he's put on them, agreed at a high level. But once it gets into some of the details, they start to backtrack a little bit. But what also starts to happen is that the Cold War tensions really are coming to the surface during this period. You have Churchill's speech. Stalin gave a very famous speech in Moscow in February, talking a much more kind of much more assertive, militaristic speech about Soviet policy. George Kennan, who was a young diplomat in Moscow at the time, youngish diplomat in Moscow at the time, wrote what became known as the Long Telegram, talking about the Cold War world coming to shape. So decision makers everywhere kind of see these tensions really coming to the surface, and historians date the beginning of the Cold War differently, but this is one of the moments that is seen as the beginning. And
This plays out then with Mao and Chiang Kai-shek and Chiang Kai-shek because they see that the cards they have at their disposal are stronger. Mao becomes more confident that Stalin's going to back him. Chiang gets more confident that the U.S. in the end of the day is going to give him the resources he needs to win a war.
That's right. So Stalin has been telling Mao through the first stretch of Marshall's mission, look, you've got to cooperate with Marshall. There's no chance that you're going to win a civil war. We're not going to do that much to help you. So Mao is feeling pressure from his ideological brethren and outside patron to negotiate. And of course, Marshall is telling the nationalists that they have to negotiate. But as these tensions come to the surface, they say, Stalin starts to give a different message to Mao. The Soviets are no longer quite so confident that a U.S. presence in China is going to be okay for them. So Mao starts to think he can really fight it out and that it'll have Soviet support. And similarly, the nationalists look at the rising tensions and say, no matter what Marshall's telling us, we're ultimately going to have the backing of the United States. And
the Republicans are going to win. That's right. We've got McCarthyism on the rise. Right. No one likes pinkos. And why would they, here we are literally killing communists. Like, what more could you ask
That's
for,
right. And you see these messages that the nationalists are getting from contacts in Washington or from their embassy in Washington are saying, this is the new world. Anti-communism is going to become the most important force in American politics. So just all you have to do is wait out Marshall and it's going to be fine. There's one very important detail, also kind of an amazing little slice of history. Marshall, before he goes, has these conversations with Truman in the White House where he talks about what he's going to do when he gets to China. And Marshall says, okay, I understand that I'm supposed to tell both sides they have to negotiate and they'll only get our support if they negotiate, and if they don't, then we won't back them. And he says, well, what should I do if the nationalists don't play along? We've been their backer for a long time. Like, are we really going to withdraw support? And Truman says, look, we don't need to worry about plan B. You'll figure it out once you're there. But Marshall, because he thinks in this way, says, no, I really want to know what I do if the nationalists don't cooperate. And Truman says, look, ultimately, we're probably going to have to back them to some degree. We're not going to withdraw support entirely. This is supposed to be a secret conversation, but that detail leaks to Chiang Kai-shek. That makes its way back to Chongqing. And so Chiang says, look, I know that I should play along with Marshall, but ultimately I know what the president said, and I know that we're going to have American backing.
And the crucial intelligence failure, lack of understanding that the Americans had was at this time, at this early period, 1945-46, Stalin was not committed. Stalin was telling Mao, slow down, put on the brakes here. And at the end of the day, his thinking, as it has come out in archives 45 years later, was that he wasn't ready to go to the mat for China in the way that he was with a lot of countries in the Eastern Bloc.
Right.
I mean, there was no napkin agreement that Churchill had with Stalin, kind of carving up China in the way that they did with Greece and Poland and Hungary. But at the same time, he was not in the mindset where it seems like looking back with 2020 hindsight, there was this window where if Chiang Kai-shek really put on the gas in these first few months, he could have done away with a lot of the threat that the communists ended up posing to him and his government.
But that is the kind of interesting counterfactual question. Stalin at this point sees the communists who Stalin is in traditional Marxist thought, the Chinese communists didn't really look like revolutionaries. They're not supposed to be these cave Marxists as Stalin called them. They were kind of agricultural. It was rural. That's not what revolutions were supposed to look like according to the theory. So he looked at Mao and said, you're not I don't trust you ideologically. You don't look like a real communist to me. I don't think you can win. And so he really sees them as a way to get concessions out of the nationalists to make sure that Soviet interests are protected in the new China.
So things are falling apart. We're fighting in Manchukuo we're fighting in former Manchukuo, and we have worse and worse relations between the Chinese and between the two Chinese parties. We have an army base named the Temple of 1,000 Sleeping Colonels. We have American troops driving too fast and getting in car crashes, which is also something you heard in Iraq and Afghanistan pretty frequently. But Truman at some point says, Marshall, you got to give this one more shot. Fly back there, see what you can do. And even though he, according to his wife, manfully struggles, ultimately it's to no avail. Right. So Chiang Kai-shek, he has this great line trying to explain why this whole thing is falling apart. And he says that trying to negotiate with the CCP is like trying to catch a fish in a tree. But I'm curious if you could sort of walk us through this period of Marshall's final push to see if he could salvage something from what seemed so promising only a few months earlier.
Right, so Marshall's back in Washington in the spring of 1946, putting together this economic assistance package, this $500 million assistance package, which is an enormous amount of money at the time, still a lot by the standards of American assistance. And Marshall keeps hearing from people on the other side of the Pacific that things are coming apart and he really needs to come back and put them back together. So finally, at the end of April, he goes back. He brings Catherine Marshall, his wife, to be with him for the remaining months, and tries to repeat what he had done in the first part of his mission. He'd put together these agreements, and he thinks with just a little work, he can put them back together. But it turns out the forces of dissolution, both from within the two sides in China, but also internationally, as the Cold War tensions really start to rise, just become too much for him. So it's this really grueling period where you watch him struggling manfully, as Catherine Marshall said, trying to broker agreements and putting out public statements and putting pressure on both sides, trying to do whatever he can to get back to the place where they'd been early on in the mission, and at every stage failing to do so. Dean Acheson, who was back in Washington as the Undersecretary of State and would later become Marshall's deputy, kept saying that he's like Sisyphus in China, just kind of rolling the boulder up the hill over and over and over again.
Can you tell the story quickly of his last hurrah, his idea that he was going to make an exit so grand and shocking that it would shock the players back to the negotiating table?
So Marshall, at a certain point, Truman is watching Marshall from Washington and decides that he wants to make Marshall a Secretary of State. This is, Marshall as a diplomat and statesman rather than Marshall as military man. And so Truman sends Dwight Eisenhower over in the spring of 1946 to make this request to Marshall. And Marshall says, well, first let me finish up my mission here. The president's willing to let him come home, but Marshall thinks he needs to do everything he possibly can to try to stave off a full-scale civil war between the communists and nationalists in China. Marshall tries and tries and tries. There's an amazing moment when he even surprises Zhou Enlai by hiding behind a screen in a living room to try to get him back to talk. So he just does everything he can.
Which I am sure is an idea he got from reading some popular literature,
exactly.
Chinese, Chinese, American writing, some Chinese style fiction.
It's this the kind of almost comical moment where he has another general invite Joe over for lunch and then comes out from behind the screen so he can talk to him. But he goes through all these steps and towards the end he decides, look, I'm not going to be able to broker this agreement between the National and Communists. There's no chance of really coming to the kind of agreement, realizing the kind of vision of a new China that I thought was possible early on. But I do think I can persuade the nationalists to start reforming and handling military strategy and economic policy in a way that we think will be more sustainable and more likely to make American support pay off in terms of success. So in his final months, that's really his focus. How do you lay the groundwork for a nationalist government that will be sustainable? The problem is that what he thinks is necessary and what Chiang Kai-shek and other key nationalists think is necessary is totally different. So he's kind of trying to persuade them to change. And in his final moment, he says, "Okay, I'm gonna leave. I'm gonna take the Secretary of State job that Truman has offered me, but I'm gonna put out this very kind of bracing final statement before I leave, which will shock both sides back into what he sees as a more sensible course." The problem is that he thinks that the Secretary of State job won't be announced until after all sides in China have had a chance to react. Instead, it's announced, it's leaked early, and before the final statement can really have its effect, they learn that he has a new job, and everyone kind of shuts up.
Sure. This experience has a lot of parallels, and as you're right, leads into his formulation of the Marshall Plan. Could you talk a little bit about how his time in China influenced how he thought about what the U.S. could do to prop up democracy and liberal governments in the rest of the world?
Yeah, it was a really striking realization as I was going through this, because you kind of look at these as distinct periods in history if you kind of study them on their own. But as you try to kind of go through these months, looking over Marshall's shoulder, in a sense, you see that he went from this incredibly intense 13 months where he's in China trying to think not just about how to broker these agreements, but also what it's going to take for a society to be strong enough to resist the forces of revolution and civil war, what it's going to take for a different kind of government to resist the force of a communist rebellion. And he starts to focus a lot on things like, do people have enough food? Do people have jobs? Is there kind of a prospect for an opposition to be part of a government, even if it's not a communist opposition? And as you walk through these months with Marshall, you see that he goes from these 13 months in China immediately into the Secretary of State job. He takes off 1 week flying back over the Pacific, but then is back in Washington, suddenly looking at a world where Soviet power seems to be on the march, where there's this kind of communist menace everywhere, and non-communist societies seem to be in disarray, where people are starving, there's not enough, inflation is surging out of control, governments seem really on the verge of collapse. And as he starts to, with other members of the State Department, with the new policy planning staff that he creates, and with George Kennan at its head, he starts to put together this plan for Europe that he would announce at Harvard in June 1947 and it would become known as the Marshall Plan. And that was really about the realization that addressing the problems of economics and kind of humanitarian issues needed to be at the center of American foreign policy. That really the first thing we had to do in order to secure democratic allies or non-communist allies, secure American interests, was to address those problems. And that's really something that he starts to think about in China. And a lot of the language that he would use in talking about the Cold War more broadly and problems in Western Europe is really the same language he's using in China a few months earlier. So the intellectual insights that become the Marshall Plan really grow out of the strategic insights, really grow out of his time in China. The flip side of this is that he becomes very focused on the willingness of partner leaders and governments to do what we think is necessary in order to make that assistance work. So, he says again and again in formulating the Marshall Plan, the Europeans really have to take the lead. We can support them, but the key steps have to be taken by our partners.
Sure.
And that is something that he thought was, he saw that willingness in the case of Western Europe and did not in the case of China, which really helps explain his reticence to commit more there.
Sure. There's an interesting connection, which is sort of neither here nor there, but another one of the interesting beats in the post-World War II career of Marshall is almost foiling America's support of Israel. And, Truman was for it, but Marshall actually threatened to resign, saying that, and this would have, had he followed through with this may have ended up changing Truman's mind. And, no documentation here, but my sense is that seeing a civil war tear apart a country in the way that it did with China may have influenced his views on that. This was always a little wrinkle of history that confused me, but your book helped me make sense of it.
It's an interesting question. I don't know the answer, but he does become kind of skeptical of the ability of an American military intervention to solve someone else's civil war, which is a problem that we would face again and again throughout the Cold War. But this kind of moment in China is really the first confrontation with it.
So let's come to Barack Obama, your former boss. So he seems to have a lot of overlaps in mentality when it comes to Marshall. You mentioned that Niebuhr was actually a big fan of Marshall, and Obama famously said that a lot of his worldview came from Niebuhr, and the realization that power is important and fighting needs to happen every once in a while, but is still something that should be avoided almost at all costs. So if you could kind of compare and contrast how both of these two leaders thought about the use of American power, probably most instructively when it came to the Syria question.
Yeah, I mean, so I think what you get from both of them, and Marshall, what is so interesting about Marshall is that he is seen in some ways as this kind of embodiment of a heroic American leadership in this period. He was obviously kind of this key figure in World War II. He really argued for a strong American international role in the post-World War II years when we were kind of creating the structures of American foreign policy that lasted through the Cold War and to the present. The creation of NATO and our kind of alliance structures. All of that was being forged by Marshall and people around him in this period. So he, on the one hand, saw what American power, broadly defined, could accomplish, but he also recognized that you needed to be very smart about where you applied it, that you couldn't apply power everywhere or try to solve every problem, because you would end up just wasting resources and not solving any of them. You need to be very, very selective about where you applied it. This really grows out of his experience as a military figure during World War II, where he was facing this problem of trying to run a gigantic global war where there were kind of endless demands for resources. There were kind of all kinds of places where you could have sent American troops or sent American aid to partners fighting the Germans or Japanese, but you had to really pick and choose your battles. So it became, when applied to American foreign policy or grand strategy more broadly, a really kind of a case-by-case principle, a pragmatism, a recognition that power could do a lot, and military power could do a lot, economic assistance could do a lot, but that if you weren't really selective about it, if you applied it too broadly and did not pay really careful attention to what conditions would make that investment work, then you would end up doing more harm than good.
Do you think the process of researching and writing a book like this would make you a better policy professional in the future? How do you think the process of doing bureaucratic history like this influences you personally on these sorts of questions?
One thing that I wanted to do, and that I hope I have done with the book, is remind people who are studying or doing foreign policy now that very mythologized figures like Marshall and Acheson and Truman and others around him failed to do things as well. That is not this kind of story of them going from success to success, but a much more complicated story in this period. And then, the other, going back to your earlier question about narrative history, I think a lot of what is often lost in our retelling of history is the kind of trade-offs and choices that decision makers faced at the time, the limitations they faced at the time. So it's easy to kind of go back and talk about counterfactuals, but you really need to go kind of inhabit those moments and think about what exactly the choices at hand were and what they knew and what they didn't know, what they should have known but didn't know, or what they couldn't have known at all. Mm-hmm. And that is often lost in the retelling, but that's much more, I think, kind of instructive when it comes to facing problems as a decision maker or analyst now.
Sure. Do you have any advice out there for other non-PhDs looking to take on a project of this size and scale, both from a research perspective, a funding perspective, a topic selection perspective? What would you have told yourself 5 years ago?
That's a really interesting question. One thing that's really striking when you do a book is you just have to really believe in the project and really be interested in the story. There are years where it's just kind of this solitary labor without much sense of where it's going, where you can feel like you're a little bit lost in the wilderness.
Sure.
But if you believe in the ultimate value of the project, or kind of of the story, really, ultimately that's what it's about, you're able to get through it. If not, I think I would have kind of
turn it into a magazine piece. And,
or who knows, or just kind of, gone and opened a coffee shop or something and given up on the whole enterprise. But, so that is something that I was lucky to have something that did hold me through that period. There's a lot in archives, even archives that seem, like they're really well plowed. So there are, places where you will not be the first person to go through something, but that does not mean that every important detail or interesting detail is mined from that archive. The thing that I found most useful was going to, not necessarily the official documents or the main characters, but the less important figures who are not names known to history for the most part, but who were present for a lot of the key episodes in Marshall's China mission and can kind of tell the story in, a richer way, in a fuller way. So it's the kind of assistants and or reporters and young officers who are around Marshall and who are writing, in diaries or writing letters to their wife. There's one amazing young diplomat named John Melby in this story who is having an affair at the time with a woman named Lillian Hellman, who's of this very prominent left-wing screenwriter and playwright. Melby's writing her these amazing letters almost every day where he's talking about, Marshall's mood. Marshall came, here's what happened in the meeting, but that's, kind of in the official record. Here's what Marshall said when he, walked into the hallway afterwards. Here's what the gossip was at the party. Here's what the, communists were saying when we were, drinking together.
Sure.
And so going in and looking not just at the kind of, main characters or famous figures, but going to those kind of less well-known secondary characters and using them to really add richness to the story that you don't get from the official record proved very, very valuable.
So aside from the Marshall Guide to Running a Fortune 500 Company, any other topics that from this period that you think you found and need addressing by someone at some point?
I mean, there's amazing work done on this period in Chinese history, this period in U.S.-Chinese relations. I wanted to tell a story about one character and really tell the story from Marshall's perspective and
Sure.
talk about the policy debates. I think there's a lot more work to kind of fill out the comprehensive picture. This is not a story of the Soviet side of this. It's not a story of the communist side of this. I think there's a lot of archival work that someday will be done when everything is open that will really fill out the full history. And I look forward to reading all that.
Awesome. Dan, thanks so much for coming on China Econ Talk.
Thanks so much. My pleasure.
China Econ Talk is edited by Jason McRonald and Kaiser Kuo and is a proud member of the Sinica Network from Sup China. For other great shows on contemporary China, check out the Caixin Sinica Business Brief, the Pan Daily Tech Buzz China, the New Voices Podcast, Ta for Ta, and of course, the Sinica Podcast. Until next week.
Look at me， 从上到下，就哪怕小的细节也要美到爆炸。带上有钱，节奏踩在脚下，嫉妒的也只能在网上叫骂。新一代女王出现，快点都给我让开！我从来不戴眼看他们设下的障碍，衣服换来换去怎么办？一选择头疼，这里好心情，在踩新油门。女王的心意，耀眼的星星，时尚的精英，搭配什么看我的心情，你可以亲吻我。